Previously on Inside the 20 by Basement Brewed Fantasy Football.
Of BBFF's Inside the 20, we took a deep dive into the Atlanta Falcons hiring Raheem Morris as their new and old head coach, as well as their hiring of Zach Robinson as their new offensive coordinator. And more importantly, we took a deep dive into what that's going to mean from a fantasy football standpoint heading into 2024. So, if you missed that episode and you want to catch up, the really cool thing about the internet is that you can press pause and do just that. But on today's episode of Inside the 20 by Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, we are going to take a deep dive into the Carolina Panthers hiring of Dave Canales as their new head coach and offensive play caller. And I gotta tell you, the more I did my research on the hiring, the more excited I got about what it means for fantasy football, what it means for the Carolina Panthers, and what it means for this episode of BBFF's Inside the 20. So if you're planning on playing fantasy football in 2024 and you like the idea of outsmarting your friends, or if you're a Carolina Panthers fan, this is one you're not going to want to miss. What is up, my friend? Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for tuning into episode 3 of Inside the 20 by Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. I'm your very decaffeinated host, Mikey Henninger, and I gotta tell you, I'm really excited about today's episode, but first, I gotta let you know that we did call an audible.
Instead, the ball is moved. But it's a tough
Okay, if you listen to episode 2 that was released on Tuesday, I wrapped that episode by previewing Friday morning's show, another episode of In the Trenches, which is meant to be a longer form episode, a longer form show with more faces and more voices than just my own. But during the week, I decided to call an audible and save those shows more for special releases and special occasions. We're going to replace Friday morning episodes of In the Trenches with another episode of Inside the 20. So, moving forward, you're going to get 2 episodes of Inside the 20 per week from Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, airing on Tuesday mornings and Friday mornings, with the occasional special long-form episode of In the Trenches. But as for today's episode, episode 3, I have to tell you, of the 3 episodes of Inside the 20 that I've recorded to date, this one is my favorite. Hands down, not even close. The more I did my research, and again, if you know me at all, my research is thorough. I spend an ungodly amount of time researching fantasy football and coaches and players. But the more research I did on today's subject of study, Dave Canales, the more impressed I am with his resume and what he's done as a coach in the NFL, and more importantly, because this is a fantasy football show, the more impressed and the more excited I am about what he's done from a fantasy football standpoint and what he could do with the Carolina Panthers moving forward. So Carolina hired 42-year-old Dave Canales to be their new head coach, and more importantly for fantasy football, their offensive play caller. He spent the last 14 years of his NFL coaching career in offensive roles with the Seattle Seahawks under Pete Carroll, and last year with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as the offensive coordinator. He's bringing with him, by the way, Brad Idzik, 32-year-old offensive coordinator for the Carolina Panthers, which is crazy to me that I just said 32 years old. Not because he's young, but because I'm getting to an age now where apparently NFL coaches are younger than I am. That's disturbing. But Brad Idzik, he's the new offensive coordinator for the Carolina Panthers. He's basically spent the last 5 years following Dave Canales wherever he went. When he was in Seattle, they worked together, and then he followed him to Tampa Bay, and then now he's followed him to Carolina. Because this is a fantasy football show, we are going to focus solely on Dave Canales because it's already been reported that Canales is the one that's going to be calling the plays, which is what we need for fantasy football. So what we're going to do for the remainder of this episode is we are going to go year by year discussing Dave Canales' resume as a coach in the NFL. And more importantly, we're going to talk about the impact that that's had on the players that he's coached in fantasy football. And at the end, of course, we're going to tie it to projecting what we can start to expect out of the Carolina Panthers in 2024, 2025, 2026 moving forward. And I got to tell you again, there is a lot to be excited about here if you're a fantasy football player or you're a Panthers fan. So let's dive in. But before we do, one really quick word from our sponsor. Sustain Health and Performance and their owner, Jordan Poggle, are the go-to resource for Basement Brewed fantasy football subscribers that are looking to lose weight and keep it off for good. In fact, one BBFF subscriber lost over 30 pounds in their first 4 months working with Jordan, and I myself worked with Jordan when I needed to lower my cholesterol and lower my blood pressure. And by the way, I also accidentally lost 11 pounds, which was never the focus, but my wife isn't complaining at all. So if you're looking for a simple and a sustainable and an effective way where you can lose weight and, more importantly, keep it off for good, all while performing your best every single day, then you need to contact Jordan. Get in touch with him on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or just follow the link that we left for you in the show notes to learn more about how he can work with you too. And when you do connect with him, let him know that Mikey sent you, because BBFF subscribers get 10% off their first 4 months of working with Jordan. Sponsor. All right, so between the years of 2010 and 2012, Dave Canales served as the offensive quality control coach for Pete Carroll and the Seattle Seahawks. I wasn't entirely sure what that means or what that entails, so I actually texted Lane Taylor, last Friday's guest from In the Trenches, and I said, hey man, what exactly does this role mean? And he basically told me that it's somewhat of a learning role. It's a grunt work role for a new coach who's trying to learn the ropes and learn the system as a newer offensive coach. So we're going to skip those years because they weren't entirely influential from a play calling or a player development standpoint. Same thing goes for 2013 and 2014 when he was the assistant quarterbacks coach underneath Carl Smith, where he gets his first real gig basically heading up a department for the Seattle Seahawks was between the years 2015 and 2018 when he was the wide receivers coach for the Seattle Seahawks. And during that time, in 2015, Doug Baldwin was the wide receiver 10, despite Seattle finishing 28th in passing attempts. Baldwin caught 78 passes for over 1,000 yards and 14 touchdowns. In 2016, Baldwin caught 94 passes for over 1,100 yards and 7 touchdowns. He was the wide receiver 8, despite Seattle finishing 18th in passing attempts. And then in 2017, Baldwin caught 75 passes for 991 yards and 8 touchdowns, finishing as fantasy's wide receiver 13, despite Seattle finishing 16th in passing attempts. Okay, so Doug Baldwin was the wide receiver 13 or better in every year that Dave Canales was the wide receivers coach, despite Seattle having lower than average passing volume. And by the way, all 3 of those seasons, 2015, 2016, 2017, all 3 of those seasons were the best of Doug Baldwin's short-lived 8-year career. All 3 years were his career highs in targets, catches, yards, and touchdowns, and all of it happened on Dave Canales' watch. Moving into 2018 and 2019, Dave Canales was the quarterbacks coach under Pete Carroll and the Seattle Seahawks. And once again, we saw some pretty significant success from the player that he was coaching. Russell Wilson in 2018 threw 35 touchdowns and only 7 interceptions, finishing as fantasy football's QB9, despite Seattle finishing dead last in pass attempts. Every other team in the NFL threw more passes than the Seattle Seahawks, and yet Russell Wilson threw 35 touchdowns and finished as fantasy's QB9. In 2019, Russ threw for over 4,100 yards, 31 more touchdowns, and just 5 interceptions, all despite Seattle finishing 23rd in passing attempts when Russell Wilson finished as fantasy's QB3. Okay, so he was the QB3 and the QB9 in years where Seattle finished 23rd and dead last in pass attempts. And oh, by the way, in those 2 years under Dave Canales, Russ enjoyed the 3rd most passing yards of his career, the 2nd most passing touchdowns, and the 5th most passing touchdowns in a single season in Russell Wilson's 12-year career, both years of which were under Dave Canales. So then in 2020 and 2021, Dave Canales became the passing game coordinator for the Seattle Seahawks. In 2020, Seattle finished 17th in pass attempts and 16th in passing yards, but 3rd in passing touchdowns. So very, very efficient. Russ threw for over 4,200 yards, 40 touchdowns, and 13 interceptions, finishing as Fantasy's QB6. That year, by the way, was the highest completion percentage of his career at 68.9%. And it was also the second most yards in a single season and the most touchdowns that Russell Wilson has ever thrown in a single season. Moving into 2021, the Seattle Seahawks finished 31st in pass attempts, so second to last, 23rd in yards, but again, they threw the 10th most touchdown passes. Russ threw for over 3,100 yards, 25 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions in 14 games. He was the QB 13 in fantasy points per game, so a bit of a down year for Russell Wilson, but it also proved to be Russell Wilson's last season playing for the Seattle Seahawks before he moved on to Denver. So now we're moving on to 2022, and in my opinion, this is where it gets really, really fun. Because in 2022, Dave Canales was the quarterback's coach for the Seattle Seahawks, and this time, it wasn't Russell Wilson, it was none other than Geno Smith, who people wrote off, but he didn't write back. Geno threw for over 4,200 yards, 30 touchdowns, and 11 interceptions. He finished as fantasy football's QB5 out of nowhere, despite Seattle finishing just 15th in passing attempts. Okay, it was easily the best year of Geno Smith's 10-year career. He set highs in completion percentage, yards, touchdowns, and by the way, the following year, the first year without Dave Canales in Seattle, he still had a solid year, but he fell back to earth with 3,600 yards, 20 touchdowns, and 9 interceptions, finishing as Fantasy's QB 19 in his first year without Dave Canales. So it's a one-year sample size, but it's a good-looking one-year sample size where it looked like Dave Canales is a quarterback whisperer that revived the career of Geno Smith. And quick little preview, he did the same moving into 2023 with Baker Mayfield. Okay, so now we move into 2023. And after 13 years under Pete Carroll in Seattle, Dave Canales took his first opportunity as an offensive coordinator in the NFL with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, including his first ever chance to be the guy that calls the offensive plays, which is what we're looking for in fantasy football. Now, at the macro level, at the team level, it doesn't look great at first glance. Tampa Bay was 20th in scoring, 23rd in offensive yards, and they were a pretty slow offense. They ran the 25th most, or in other words, they finished 25th in offensive plays run. That said, despite being a particularly slow offense, they were pretty efficient. They finished 25th in offensive plays run, but they finished 16th in percentage of drives that ended in points. However, they did finish 19th in pass attempts, 17th in pass yards, 23rd in rushing attempts, dead last in rushing yards, and 28th in rushing touchdowns. So all of that sounds bad, right? It sounds like it was a pretty bad offense. How in the world did this guy get a head coaching gig with such a bad offense? But there's a couple things to note here. Number one, again, they were efficient. They scored they had the 16th highest percentage of offensive drives that ended in points. Number two, their defense, Tampa Bay's defense, was awful. They were a bottom 7 defense that could not get off the field. So Tampa Bay's offense really didn't even have the ball as frequently as their defense was on the field. And number 3, this is where it gets really fun and really exciting for fantasy football purposes, is when you dig into the Tampa Bay Buccaneers individually and what their individuals were able to do from a statistical standpoint. All right, so let's go position by position, starting with the most important one, which is the quarterback. Baker Mayfield completed 64.3% of his passes for 4,044 yards and 28 touchdown passes. All of which, by the way, were new career highs in Baker Mayfield's 6-year career. Once again, he finished as the QB 10, despite Tampa Bay finishing 19th in passing attempts. So more evidence of Dave Canales creating fantasy useful seasons and being really efficient with his guys despite low volume. We've seen him revive the career of Geno Smith. We've seen him revive the career of Baker Mayfield. Do we have a QB whisperer on our hands heading into the Bryce Young era. Moving on to the running backs, let's talk about Rachaad White for a minute, right? We already discussed that Tampa Bay was bad as a team statistically. They finished 23rd in attempts, 32nd in rushing yards, and 28th in scoring. But Rachaad White himself handled 336 touches. That includes 64 catches on 70 targets for over 1,500 scrimmage yards and 9 touchdowns. So if you want to look at averages, Rachaad White averaged 19.76 touches per game, which is mouth-watering in fantasy football. He averaged 4.12 targets per game, which is key to unlocking both your floor and your ceiling as a running back in fantasy football. And he averaged 90.5 scrimmage yards per game. He finished as fantasy football's RB4. He was a top 4 running back in fantasy football, despite the fact that the team finished 23rd in rushing attempts, 32nd in yards, and 28th in scoring. He was very much a workhorse. He's very much what we want and what we look for in fantasy football. And by the way, the next closest running back on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers last year was Chase Edmonds, who touched the ball just 4.8 times per game. Moving on to the wide receivers, let's start with one of my favorite wide receivers of all time, Mr. Mike Evans. Last year, under Dave Canales, Evans had 136 targets. He caught 79 of them for over 1,200 yards and 13 touchdowns, which, by the way, tied for the league lead in touchdown catches. He finished as fantasy's wide receiver 7, certainly pretty useful. And in his whole 10-year career, he spent 1 year with Dave Canales and posted his 3rd most catches in a season, 3rd most yards in a season, and 2nd most touchdowns in a season, all as a 30-year-old veteran wide receiver under Dave Canales. The wide receiver 2 was Chris Godwin, who had 130 targets, catching 83 of them for over 1,000 yards, just 2 touchdowns. He did finish as a top 28 wide receiver, which doesn't sound great, but it still was the 2nd most targets and 3rd most yards of Chris Godwin's 7-year career. Last but not least, talking about the tight end, nothing too special here, but Cade Otton did set new career highs, even though it was only his 2nd year, but still, he's ascending. He's heading in the right direction under Dave Canales. He had 67 targets, 47 catches, 455 yards, and 4 touchdowns to finish as fantasy football's number 19 tight end. So, to recap on Dave Canales' career to this point as a coach in the NFL, we have seen him get career years out of Russell Wilson, Geno Smith, Baker Mayfield. I mean, he literally revived both of those careers. Is he a QB whisperer, which is what Carolina needs? We saw him get career years out of Doug Baldwin, Mike Evans. We saw him create a bell cow out of Rachaad White. It seems like he is extracting and getting the most out of every player that he's in charge of coaching. But what exactly does that mean for the Carolina Panthers heading into the 2024 fantasy football season? Let's dive in right here, right now. But first, a really quick word from me. If you're looking for the ultimate secret sauce in your fantasy football leagues, something that I can all but guarantee you your league mates don't even know exists, then you got to get over to basementbrewedff.com and see what we're doing over there. If you're new to the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football channel, then the one thing you need to know about me personally is that I actually quit an ascending decade-long B2B sales career so that I could dive all in 100% and focus only on this fantasy football analysis business. So now I'm spending 30 plus hours per week digging through spreadsheets, looking at fantasy football strategy, and researching every single player on every single team and making it all available to you so that you have a wealth of knowledge at your disposal anytime you need to go in and crush your friends. So, assuming you're the type of person that likes to outsmart your friends, dominate your leagues, win contests on FanDuel and DraftKings, cash in on NFL bets, then you got to get over to basementbrewedff.com, where we already have 300 plus fantasy football players doing just that with our insights, our resources, and our amazing, amazing online community. Plus, the first 3 subscribers that enter promo code INSIDE20, all caps, all one word, they're going to get 20% off their first year subscription over at basementbrewedff.com. So pause the episode and go now. All in all, this is a big hire for the Panthers. This is big. If I'm a Panthers fan, I'm really excited about this. It's good news from a fantasy football standpoint, and candidly, it's probably unrealistic to expect this massive turnaround in 2024 from the travesty we witnessed in 2023. But this is great news for Carolina moving forward, 2024, 2025, 2026. It's obviously a terrific, terrific hire for Bryce Young, especially after the atrocious rookie campaign we saw from the first overall pick last year in a very dysfunctional Carolina offense. I mean, Dave Canales is a guy who revived the careers of Baker Mayfield, Geno Smith. He got career years out of Russell Wilson. This is a terrific hire for the former first overall pick and the young developmental mind of Bryce Young. From a fantasy football standpoint, Bryce Young's going to be dirt cheap. He's going to be basically free. I won't recommend drafting him in your typical fantasy football leagues, but if you're a best ball player, and if you're not familiar with what that is, stay tuned. We're going to talk about best ball here pretty soon. But if you're a best ball player, I think there's some sneaky free upside to Bryce Young as your third quarterback in a best ball league. At the running back position, Dave Canales created an absolute workhorse and a fantasy football stud out of Rachaad White. Now, what does that mean in Carolina? Is it still Chuba Hubbard season? I know Derek Devereaux is hoping it is, probably believes it is. Chuba Hubbard is in a contract year, so there's plenty of motivation to have the best year of his career, but we also have a quote-unquote pissed off, his words, Miles Sanders heading into year 2 of a 4-year contract. So stay tuned to the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football channel, podcasts, all of my writings on basementbrewedff.com, because we will be monitoring this situation closely and adjusting our ranks, tiers, and analysis accordingly. But whoever takes over that RB1 role in Carolina, it could be a fruitful campaign, and we know they're going to be cheap in fantasy football drafts. Wide receiver is where things get really, really hairy for the Carolina Panthers in 2024 as it pertains to fantasy football. Now, we know Dave Canales is more than capable of creating a stud at the wide receiver position in fantasy football. We saw him do it 3 years in a row with Doug Baldwin. We saw him do it with Mike Evans last year. But who's it going to be in year 1 with Carolina? Last year's wide receiver 1 was Adam Thielen, who had a great hot start to the year, but kind of tailed off as the season went on, which isn't necessarily surprising considering the guy is going to be 34 years old at kickoff in September. That's not nothing. Then you got DJ Chark, who is an unrestricted free agent. There's no telling if he's even going to be back with the Carolina Panthers, and if I had to bet on it, I would bet he's not back with the Carolina Panthers. The sneakiest play in the Carolina Panthers wide receiver room, at least as of right now, as of February 29th, happy leap year day, by the way, is Jonathan Mingo. Jonathan Mingo was the 39th overall pick from Mississippi by the Carolina Panthers last year. He is a sneaky late round draft pick. He's going to be dirt cheap in fantasy football drafts, and he has just as good a chance as anybody that's currently in that wide receiver room to be and finish as Carolina's wide receiver 1 heading into 2024. Now, it's always possible Carolina adds some names during free agency or during the draft, although they really don't have a lot in the way of draft capital after selling the farm to get to Bryce Young, but they do have the 33rd overall pick in this year's draft. They have pick 65. They have a 4th-round pick. They have 2 5th-round picks and a 6th-round pick, but as of right now, as of this recording, Jonathan Mingo is my favorite, a sneaky late-round pick to be the guy in Carolina, at least in 2024. Again, keep it locked onto the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football YouTube channel or podcast, or go to basementbrewedff.com to keep up with all my blogs and writings as we go through the next several months and keeping track of who that's going to be. But as of right now, Jonathan Mingo is a sneaky, sneaky play in 2024 fantasy football. Last but not least, we have Hayden Hurst, who is the team's number 1 tight end. He's entering year 2 of a 3-year contract with the Carolina Panthers. He's kind of like Bryce Young, where there's no reason to expect some gigantic ceiling or some top 12 finish from Hayden Hurst, but given all the uncertainty in the wide receiver room for the Carolina Panthers, it's not insane to think Hayden Hurst could offer some fantasy football value as a somewhat of a safety blanket for Bryce Young as a de facto go wide receiver 2 for the team. Again, not recommending a high draft pick or even any draft pick on him in fantasy football, but if you're playing in best ball leagues, there's some appeal there as your number 3 tight end on your team. That's all I got for you on today's episode of Inside the 20, which I know, blow the whistle, Tanner, throw the flag, another delay of game penalty, back to Inside the 25. I refuse to change the name to Inside the 25. I'm committed to getting this thing under 20 minutes. Stick with me.
I don't believe you.
We're going to get there. But if you like this episode and you're listening on podcast, please, please, please do me a huge favor. And I mean it when I say that. Like when creators ask you and beg you to leave a 5-star rating and review, it helps us tremendously. So please, if you're listening on podcast, leave a 5-star rating and review. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel wherever that is, just to make sure you don't miss any future episodes. In fact, come back on Tuesday morning. We'll release episode 4 of Inside the 20 or Inside the 25 or whatever. And we're going to continue our conversation on new faces in new places. And by the way, I'm getting started on my 2024 draft kit, my 2024 draft guide. So we're going to start talking best ball content here very soon. So buckle up. If there's something in particular that you would like me to discuss on the next show, whether that's a strategy, a person, a place, a player, whatever, if there's something you want me to discuss on the next show or in future episodes, please hit me up in the comments. Leave those in the comments. Hit me up on Twitter or TikTok, both of which are BBFF Mikey. Hit me up on LinkedIn at Mikey Henninger. And whenever you're ready to finally join 300 plus fantasy football players that are embarrassing their friends, dominating their leagues, cashing in on NFL bets, winning FanDuel and DraftKings contests, whenever you're ready to do that using my strategic insights, resources, and amazing online community, go over to basementbrewedff.com, choose the starter package, and the first 3 people that enter promo code Inside the 20, all one word, all caps, they are going to get 20% off their first year of that starter package subscription. That's all I got for you today. I'll see you on the fantasy football field on Tuesday. Cheers. This brew's for you.